does it mean that we should use in various deformities CPEC2 the better functional alignment in combination with...
So CPAC1 is apex distal, which means there's an oblique joint line. If you cut the joint line square, the argument from those proponents of the kinematic alignment, then you'll be lengthening the lateral femoral condyle, and that puts extra pressure on the patella, which might contribute to the pain that the patients have and the unhappiness post-surgery.
Very interesting, yeah.
Bill, can I ask you, is there any scope of modification in the CPAC in terms of incorporating CT scans? Because CT measurements of MPTA and LDFA are different as compared to full-length radiological measurements.
Yeah, so the measurement of the MPTA, the medial proximal tibial angle in particular, is different on CT scan and on standing radiographs. Yeah, so that's something we're doing some work on at the moment, measuring both CT and X-ray, and there'll be a slight difference. I don't know which is more reliable, probably the CT scan. But even on a CT scan, there's different ways you can measure it. You can measure averages, you can measure one part of the plateau, another part of the plateau. So that's all the fine detail that I think needs to be worked out.
So we start with the questions from the floor. Amar?
Is it patellar pressure is related to mechanical axis or kinematic alignment, or it's related to implant design like CR versus PS? That's a patellar pressure you are telling us.
So that study in the biomechanics lab, we were looking at patellar pressure and we were varying different things. So that was with a Smith and Nephew knee, but looking at different alignments. So if you vary the alignment and lengthen the lateral condyle, you get more pressure. If you increase the thickness of the patella, you get more patellar pressure. And
is it any specific implant, or it's because of mechanical alignment?
So that was using a single implant type and looking at kinematic versus mechanical alignment.
Amar, please.
Yeah, sure. So I'd like to have a discussion that you can lead, Thorsten, because we talked about some difficult cases where you use a hinge. I want to hear about different hinges, which hinges are better for recurvatum, which hinges are better. I mean, are they all cemented? Are they cementless? Are they condylar? Do some, control flexion gap, instability? So I need to hear some more discussion about the different types of hinges that are available.
So usually all hinges, at least in my knowledge, has cemented stems. Usually they have cemented stems. There are new developments with uncemented stems, especially in huge revisions with a huge amount of bone loss. So again, what kind of hinge are you using? Do you use sometimes pure hinges, or they are not available? Just rotating hinges here.
No, both rotating and fixed hinges are available.
Fixed hinge. When do you use a fixed hinge?
So in post-infective situation, say for example, where you need to add some antibiotic cement, I would use, but my choice is a rotating hinge mostly, because it addresses flexion and extension gap mismatch much better. And in case you have recurvatum, then you can use a bolt there to prevent recurvatum. So those are the advantages of rotating hinge.
So a fixed hinge is more stable, but the disadvantage is that it has a shorter lifespan. So when we're dealing with, say, a tumor where we think that the lifespan may be compromised and where large bone resections are required, I think that is a situation for a fixed hinge. But otherwise, I think a rotating hinge has a longer survivorship.
Another thing I would say is that patellar instability can be a problem with rotating hinge. If you have the tibia can externally rotate, the patella can dislocate. So I've seen problems with rotating hinges.
I agree completely, especially in severe valgus deformities with a lateralization of the patella. A fixed hinge is probably better than a rotating hinge. And what about recurvatum or neuropathic diseases? Would you recommend a hinge knee or more CCK knee, varus valgus stabilized knee? So what's your opinion?
So
neuropathic with, let's say post-polio or in syndromes like this, Charcot,
Yeah, they're definitely a rotating hinge.
rotating hinge knee.
Yes.
I think the
With a bumper to prevent hyperextension. So keep it in about 10 degrees or 5 degrees of flexion.
I think that's extremely important. You need some kind of protection against hyperextension. Otherwise, the mechanism will fail quickly, very quickly.
Does it depend on the severity?
On the severity of
The
the
hyperextension?
I think any kind of hyperextension, which is more than 5 to 10 degree, is case for rotating or fixed hinge knee with a bumper.
Question to Bill, a very excellent concept. I first heard that changing CPAC 1 to standard cut will distalize your lateral femoral condyle. There are 2 points which I would like to raise against this. Number one is patella never articulates with the lateral femoral condyle. It's mainly in the trochlear groove that patella is moving. Now if you distalize the lateral condyle, if you look at the knee or the implant from the frontal area, your trochlear groove of the implant will change laterally and it will be more aligned with the Q angle of the knee. And in fact, that should improve your patellar tracking and it should not cause more pain. So how do you explain that?
We weren't measuring pain, we were just measuring pressure in the kinematics. And we also looked at lateralization and medialization. So you're right, with knee replacements, usually the trochlea is also medialized. And if you can lateralize it, you'll reduce the pressure. So this is just work. We've got a PhD student looking at it at the moment, and I don't have all the answers, but I just think it's interesting to think about that lateral femoral condylar lengthening when you change the angle of your joint line.
That will change the angle of your implant also. The Q angle will change. The trochlear groove will go more laterally, isn't it?
Yeah, the Q angle will change, but I guess the pressure that we saw was at flexion, at 45 degrees and 90 degrees of flexion. So how important is the Q angle with the patellas coming down over the femur? That's when we saw the difference. So I'm not sure if the angle's what's making the difference or if it's just the tension of all of those soft tissues coming around the longer lateral femoral condyle and putting more pressure on the patella.
Maybe. Thank you.
Yeah, question to Bill again. Bill, I think the McDacy's classification, assumes that the phenotypes don't change with arthritis. But if you look at the slide that you put, the Indian CPAC 1 is 56%, so is in Japan, some of the Asian countries. But if you look at the same slide has a data of non-arthritic population, it is almost the same as the Caucasian, 22%. So what do you have to say? That, the phenotype actually changes because that without which the percentage of CPAC 1 wouldn't increase so much. And the second question, do you routinely use CPAC in your planning of the surgery and do you use it?
Yeah, it's an interesting question if the CPAC classification changes with arthritis, because as you wear, if you get bone loss, it's difficult to measure those angles, the lateral distal femoral angle, the medial proximal tibial angle, because really you wanted to measure it before they had arthritis, but if the arthritis is advanced, it's impossible to get the CPAC classification.
Exactly, but McDacy feels that these are the angles which will not change even if you have arthritis, but that probably the data doesn't show that.
So the original validation that they used compared normal knees and arthritic knees in Australia, but the arthritis is much earlier than you see in India, so it's before there's severe bone loss. So I think the goal is to understand the phenotype of the knee before they got arthritis, and that might be difficult.
Bill, Rajesh, we produced that paper from India, the CPAC, and you are partially right. But the early arthritis, when you compare to the opposite side, also we saw that majority of the Indian population falls in type 1. And the second thing is we are doing a paper where when you plan CPAC and put this one post-operative in the same bucket, the functional results in 2 years looks to be better than going haywire. That is our observation, yeah.
So your paper has to come up.
Yeah.
As Dr. Jurani pointed out, that the two-dimensional CPAC classification do not correlate with the standing CT scan. There is a paper published in Journal of Knee from Japan. they suggested that they took a 3D CT scan for all patients, and the two-dimensional CPAC classification do not correlate with the CT findings.
Yeah,
have you gone through the paper?
Yeah, I have read that, but I think we need more validation, we need more data on that.
In a severe valgus knee which you have shown, patient has post-operative foot drop. When do you attack?
So, yeah, that's a good question. I mean, if you have a post-operative palsy after operating such a difficult knee?
Yes, so this typically happens when the valgus is associated with a flexion and an external rotation deformity. And here I think there are two things. One is that you have to counsel the patient preoperatively that there may be a problem. Secondly, I think you might consider using a hinge here, because if you use a hinge, then the incidence of this palsy seems to be a little less, rather than when you try to correct everything. And the third thing is that in these, I think, do not stretch out the knee straight away on the table. Keep a little bit of flexion and then gradually take it out through physiotherapy. So these are the three things. There is a paper which says that if you do a simultaneous neurolysis, separate neurolysis of the lateral popliteal nerve, then the incidence of palsy is less. But I really don't know whether, when to make up your mind to do this extra surgery.
So, but did you try an extra surgery after it? I mean, to do neurolysis if a palsy happened?
No, I haven't. But most of the time, I have observed that it tends to recover.
Yeah, sometimes it's helpful. Some other proposals?
So
surgical proposal?
In case the patient does get, I think his question was, what do you do after the patient gets a common peroneal nerve palsy? That was his question. So
exactly.
I would get a nerve conduction, send the patient to my neurologist, see whether it's a neuropraxia or a neuroentemesis. If it's a neuropraxia, it will recover. If it is not, then you need to intervene, I think.
Yeah.
Should you bend the knee as well and make sure that there's no pressure on the nerve, no tension on the nerve?
Yep.
Yeah, that's post-operatively, but there's a growing body of evidence now that the hand surgeons, they have a very low threshold to go and explore the knee and do a neurolysis. So the first week or so you observe it, because sometimes they can very quickly recover, right, within 24, 48, a few days. But if they don't, they'll generally do ultrasounds and just have a sense of how the nerve looks and make sure that there's no transection and no other hematomas around it and that nature. And then within 2 to 3 weeks, most of them will go explore now and do it. Their comfort level working around the nerves obviously is much greater. So preoperatively, they don't recommend doing neurolysis, but postoperatively, they're very quick to do it if the foot drop does occur.
I agree completely. If you have a palsy after a severe valgus deformity with flexion deformity, operative neurolysis is not a big thing. Our neurosurgeons are doing it within 10 minutes, 5 to 10 minutes. It's just a cut of the membrane. So I would recommend it if you have such a situation. Last 2 questions, please.
Yeah, so about the ankylosed knee that we were talking about, we do an osteotomy, do the knee, that's not much of a problem, but the problem arises when you start bending the knee. You have severe stiffness as far as the quads are concerned. So what is the cutoff that you go and do a quadriceps plasty or get your plastic surgeon to do it, or till what level do you accept the knee flexion? Is a 90 on table good enough, or when do you start touching the quadriceps?
Yeah, actually it's a big topic. For want of time, I was very, very cryptic. So first of all, you have to counsel the patient that it's very unlikely that they will get a flexion beyond 90. Most of the time it will be less. But if it is 0 and you give them even 75, that's something gained. Secondly, you have to be very careful about the soft tissue sleeve and take a lot of pains to dissect it out, as intact as possible, and which may be difficult because a lot of the time it is quite fibrotic. Thirdly, whether you do a quadsplasty or not depends on your training. In our days, we did so much of polio surgery that we are probably more adept at handling soft tissue. So in the quadsplasty, you can do a patellar retinacular release to start with. Sometimes the vastus intermedius typically will be quite fibrotic, so you separate that out and you might need to excise it completely. As far as the rectus is concerned, I think you should try and preserve it as far as possible because most of the extensor power comes from that. At best, what you can do is the technique described by Dr. Ranawat, that you just pi-cross the rectus and then gain the length. The other way of gaining the length is if you proximalize the attachment of the quads by doing a TTO and just proximalize it by even 5 millimeters. Even that gives you a good deal of flexion. So those are the things you can do.
There is one point that I would want to add here. This patella is a restraining factor here. So where we are fighting for the last 5-10 degrees, patellar decompression in stiff knees is a very good method. Sometimes you can go up to the extent of near total patellectomy also, and it will surprisingly get you another 20-30 degrees range of motion, and it will continue to increase later on by the exercises also because that hard restraint is gone, and trust me, these patients won't complain for extensor lag. They will make up for it.
Okay, fair enough.
Okay, thank you. Last question, please.
It's a confusion which needs to be cleared up. So, bad varus knees, when we do the surgery, conventionally come to small varus and they stay there. Bad valgus knees come to a small valgus and stay there. Neutral knees are neutral. So where does CPAC, which we call it like a kinematic alignment, we have a pre-operative decision and we leave varus knees in varus, valgus knees in mind valgus, and neutral in neutral alignment. Where is CPAC actually helping us?
Well, the bit that's missing from just considering them varus and valgus is the joint line obliquity. And so if you have a joint line obliquity, that will change the femoral position, the tibial position, which is important in flexion. So look, this work is from Sam McDessie and others in Australia. It's not my work, I'm just quoting it. But I think, it's interesting to think about what it does to the tissues, the soft tissues around the knee, particularly when the knee bends. So the joint line obliquity is the missing piece if you just consider the limb alignment, varus, valgus or neutral.
Thank you so much.
Sorry, can I just add one to that?
Okay, the very last question.
Yes. Sorry, so the joint line obliquity, as if you see to the sports world, they're all moving away from oblique joint lines to horizontal joint lines. And in arthroplasty, most of the results that are promoting maintaining joint line obliquity to their pre-arthritic status is just looking at outcomes at 2 years. Are we balancing out against survivorship in the longer run? Because joint line obliquity will increase shear forces on the liner, or have the liners improved to a point where we don't need to worry about that as much?
I think there are 10-year plus results published. Howell just published his 16-year follow-up. There are 13-year follow-ups by Dorset Group. So I don't think the kinematic alignment or joint line obliquity increases the revision or the reoperation rate. And there are multiple 10-year plus studies now.
Same in Australia, the same group are following these.
Also stability,
Plus the
stability
joint line obliquity
is
changes.
also important compared to joint line. If the joint is stable, then the obliquity is not important.
Okay.
That is the paper says.
Plus the joint line obliquity changes during weight bearing also. I mean, what you see on X-rays is not necessarily
the next
during
session
the weight bearing
You
cycle.
stand on one leg and it's not an oblique joint line.
That's
anymore.
right.
You will cover.
So single leg stance in kinematic alignment will give you a horizontal joint line. So it depends how we are seeing our joint lines in bipedal stance or single stance.
I think the next session we are going to have again is about
Yeah,
alignment.
exactly.
I'm sure
The
Rajesh
next,
is going
that's
to
what
bring
I
it up.
wanted to say. The next session is all about alignment.